Welcome, everyone. We're just going to wait a few minutes to let everyone come into the Zoom room. In the meantime, if you want to drop in the chat where you're coming from, we would love to hear it.
I see Jacksonville, my hometown that I grew up in.
We have a great spread from across North America, but I also see we have some Australians tonight.
Ooh.
And Canadians.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you said North America. Yeah.
Well, it's so wonderful to see so many people tuning in this evening for the last event in Jane Austen and Company's series, Asia and the Regency. So I would just like to welcome you all back. My name is Anne Ferdig, and I am a recent PhD in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as well as the co-director of Jane Austen and Company. We are delighted tonight to welcome Dr. Kathryn Duncan, who will be speaking about her book, Jane Austen and the Buddha, which was just published late last year by Hoplite Books. And so we are so excited to have a recent Austenian author come and talk about their work and perhaps introduce a new way of reading Jane Austen tonight. For those of you joining us for the first time tonight, Jane Austen and Company is a free public humanities series hosted by the Jane Austen Summer Program. Our mission is to bring free events and workshops on Jane Austen and her broader global context to audiences around the world. Tonight, I am joined by my co-hosts, Dr. Inga Brody and Dr. Kimio Ogawa, as well as our technical director, Jared Powell. Now I'm going to real quick hand things over to Inga to speak a few words about what this series means.
Hi, everyone. I'm a professor in the same department as Anne and Jared, and as well as in Asian Studies and Global Studies at UNC. I co-founded and direct the Jane Austen Summer Program, which is the parent organization for Jane Austen and Company. And as Anne mentioned, we're nearing the conclusion of our third series with Jane Austen and Company. Our first was Staying at Home, Jane Austen, inspired by COVID necessities, and followed by Race and the Regency. And now we're on our 11th and final session of Asia and the Regency. And we really appreciate Dr. Kimio Ogawa taking part in this with us. This whole event, this whole series was inspired by a book that Kimio is co-editing with Tristan Connolly and on Austen and Asia. So that we'll be looking forward for that book in a year or two. So yeah, each of our events has attracted hundreds of visitors from around the world. And we'll be sending out a survey right after this event to all of you, asking your advice and suggestions on what we can do in the future, since we'd like to have another set series starting this fall again. So let me hand things over to Kimio. Our Professor Kimio Ogawa is of Sophia University in Japan.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So let me introduce Professor Kathryn Duncan. She is a professor of English at San Leo University in Florida. She has edited 2 books, Reasoning Beasts, Evolution, Cognition and Culture, 1720 to 1820, with Michael Austen, and Religion in the Age of Reason, a transatlantic study of the long 18th century, as well as publishing on topics ranging from 18th century British pirates, Methodism, evolutionary psychology, and Jane Austen. She has taught courses on Austen, pirates, Harry Potter, monsters, and bibliotherapy. She writes a weekly blog on literary mindfulness that can be found on Medium. She'll be attending the Jane Austen Summer Program and presenting at the JASNA, Jane Austen Society of North America, in fall 2022. I have actually just read an article about Professor Duncan's attempt to integrate bibliotherapy as part of Austen's literature course. So I'm very much thrilled to hear more about how Buddhism and mindfulness is connected to Austen novels. But before we hear from Professor Duncan, we need a few words of instruction from our technical director, Jared Powell. Jared?
Yes, thank you, Kimio. Okay, so I'd like to take a moment to explain how tonight's event will work. The event will last about 90 minutes in total, including Q&A throughout and after the presentation. Let me share my screen. You are welcome to put your questions for our speaker into the Q&A box. And then at the end of the presentation, Kimio, Inga, and Anne will take turns asking them to Professor Duncan. So questions for the speaker. Let me bring my little mouse here in the Q&A icon at the toolbar on the bottom of your Zoom window. And then if you would like to chat with other attendees, as many of you have already figured out, you can chat through the chat window there. Just be sure that you set it to that everyone can see, because it might default to panelists instead of everyone. And then speaking of the chat, we usually enjoy a robust chat. And if you would like to hide the notifications, if you find those distracting, I've got a few slides here that walk you through that process. So if you're on a Windows PC, first you click your chat icon to bring up the window. It typically brings it up in its own separate little floating window. You click on the top bar there and then hold that and drag it off screen. If you are on a Mac computer, you again hit that chat icon. My control toolbar might be in the way here, so apologies if it's cutting off part of that there, but there's a little caret drop-down menu there that pops out, and then you'll click pop out to again get it in its own window. Click at the top of that window, and drag it off screen. And then finally, if you're joining us on a tablet such as an iPad, similar process. You click the chat icon, then click the bell, and you can mute your notifications there. And as always, I'll be paying attention to the chat. If you have any other technical issues, just be sure to shoot a message out there and I will help you out. And with that, I believe we're back to Anne.
Thank you, Jared. Please note that tonight's program will be recorded and it will be up on our website, available to view within the next few weeks. And without further ado, I'd like to hand things off to Dr. Kathryn Duncan.
All right, let me just share screen. And that will go away in a moment. There we go. Okay, well, first of all, thank you so very, very much to everyone in Jane Austen and Company for organizing these talks, which have been absolutely amazing, and for inviting me. It is really a great honor to be here. Thank you to all of you who are here. I really appreciate it. I'm just going to see if I can get a different view. Okay, so Jane Austen and the Buddha. I want to give you just an overview of the book, the kind of the central argument. And then I thought I could just give a kind of brief explanation of the various chapters on Austen books, just in the interest of time, obviously. And then I would love to entertain your questions about any explanations you'd like me to go deeper into with any of the novels. Okay, so my dissertation director once told me that our choice of dissertation topic says something about our personalities. I do not know exactly what my choice of 18th century British pirates as my dissertation topic says about me yet, but I do know exactly where the idea of Jane Austen and the Buddha came from, because it is an odd connection. It actually comes from a pretty personal space. I was going through a really difficult time in my life. My mother had been diagnosed with dementia, and I was going through a divorce, and I was really struggling. And as someone who was a lifelong avid reader, I found that I actually could no longer read for pleasure. I could reread, and I turned to Harry Potter repeatedly in my rereading. I would start with the first book, I'd make my way all the way through Deathly Hallows, and then I would start again. But eventually, I really couldn't even do that. Finally, I got to the point where essentially I could read one book, and that was Jane Austen's Persuasion. I've always loved Jane Austen. I read my first Jane Austen novel for fun when I was a teenager. So it makes sense that I would be able to read an author who was important to me and comforting to me, but I couldn't quite figure out why it was Persuasion, because Persuasion is actually not really the lightest of her novels, of course. So like any good researcher, I tried to figure this out. And of course, the place that I turned to was BuzzFeed, because where else would you look? So it turns out that when I took the Which Jane Austen Heroine Are You?, I discovered that I was Anne Elliot. I didn't really want to be Anne Elliot. I wanted to be Elizabeth Bennet because I am hilarious, as everyone knows. But it was Anne Elliot, and I took it 4 times. So I know that it was, in fact, Anne Elliot. Though I could not read fiction for fun anymore, I was able to read nonfiction. And I had discovered these works about Buddhism that were very much speaking to me. I was reading Thich Nhat Hanh, I was reading Charlotte Joko Beck, I was reading the Dalai Lama, and suddenly it all came together for me. Persuasion, Austen, and BuzzFeed quiz. I was reading Persuasion over and over again because Austen and the Buddha shared an understanding of suffering. And that's when I started writing Jane Austen and the Buddha. It makes historical sense in a way. So Austen was writing at the end of the Enlightenment, 1660 to 1815. And this is a time period when there was a new and increased interest in the individual. John Locke wrote, "No man's knowledge here can go beyond his experience," in his essay concerning human understanding. So suddenly the idea was that experience was all, that we knew the world through our senses, and that the individual was very important to our understanding of the world. Well, the Buddha got there first. Thich Nhat Hanh writes, "A teacher cannot give you the truth. The truth is already in you. You only need to open yourself, body, mind, and heart." Austen got that as well. In Mansfield Park, she writes, "We all have a better guide in ourselves if we would attend to it, more than any other person can be." And if you guys will just excuse me for a second, I really am having trouble with the viewing of my screen. So I'm going to exit for just 1 second. I apologize. And I just need to be able to, there we go, minimize this. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. Technology is so fun. Okay. So Peter Knox Shaw, in his really wonderful book on Jane Austen and the Enlightenment, argues that Austen's novels very much embody the important ideas of the Enlightenment: science, reason, and social reform, as well as an emphasis on the limits of individual heroism and distrust of doctrine. Austen shared those ideas. With Austen, we get an emphasis on the individual and on the individual's place in society. This is something that we see in Buddhism as well. There's an emphasis on the individual because, again, of this emphasis on experience, but there's always the knowledge and understanding of the interconnectedness of everything and everyone, or as Thich Nhat Hanh calls it, interbeing. Within the Enlightenment and Austen, and also within Buddhism, there's an emphasis on moderation called the middle way in Buddhism. The Buddha started life as a prince who lived a life of luxury and ease. When he left the palace seeking enlightenment, he studied with ascetics, with an extreme discipline, and did not find enlightenment. So he left and he went and meditated under a Bodhi tree where he discovered the Four Noble Truths. And what he realized is that the answer was not extreme luxury, and the answer was not asceticism. It was this middle way, this moderation, which again is a British Enlightenment idea that we see showing up in Austen. What science today, what Buddhism, what the Enlightenment, and what Austen also all understood was the importance of stories. Sharon Salzberg, a meditation teacher in Real Love, The Art of Mindful Connection, writes, our minds are wired to create order, a cohesive narrative, and our stories are our anchors. Zen teacher David Lloyd writes in The World is Made of Stories, like the proverbial fish that cannot see the water they swim in, we do not notice the medium we dwell in. Unaware that our stories are stories, we experience them as the world. In other words, we are storying our lives and unaware that we are doing it. Now, the storying makes sense because of this idea of theory of mind. So within the notion of evolutionary psychology, there's the belief that we as humans evolved not just physically, thank you opposable thumbs, in order for our species to survive, but also through psychological adaptations. And one of the most important of those is theory of mind, which is the ability to read other people through reading and interpreting things such as body language and expression in order to attribute mood, motivation, truthfulness, etc., to others during social interactions and to predict future behavior. Now, this is crucial for us because we're social creatures. And essentially what that means is every day of our lives, we're reading others and we're writing, we're making predictions. The problem is that we're often wrong. Robert Wright in Why Buddhism is True addresses that. We were built by natural selection, and natural selection works to maximize genetic proliferation, period. In addition to not caring about the truth per se, it doesn't care about our long-term happiness. So there's this real connection between stories and another evolutionary psychological adaptation, which is anxiety. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist monk who passed away recently, and the Dalai Lama argue that anxiety is the most prevalent form of suffering in the Western world. And modern science agrees. Now, anxiety comes from storying. It's different from fear. If I'm out on a run and I see a poisonous snake, then I am in direct danger and I have fear. There is something that is threatening me. If I'm out on a run and I'm afraid, and I think it's possible that there could be a poisonous snake, then I'm creating a story. I am creating fear about something that might happen. So anxiety is a helpful adaptation because I don't want to encounter poisonous snakes, but it also can cause us suffering if we're not aware of what we're doing. Austen understood this. She doesn't use the word anxiety, but she says in Persuasion, what wild imaginations one forms where dear self is concerned, how sure to be mistaken. Pema Chodron, a Buddhist nun, says what makes us suffer is the way we think about what's happening. Now that takes us to the Four Noble Truths, which is that essential idea that the Buddha found as he was meditating under the Bodhi tree. It's important for us to remember that life inevitably will involve pain. We are going to grow old. We are going to be sick. We are going to die. These are just facts of life and we can't change them. But those things are not necessarily what we mean by suffering. Suffering has to do with the stories and the feelings and the thoughts that we create around those inevitable things from life. I should also note that suffering, of course, is an English translation. The word in Pali is dukkha, and that can be translated instead into unease or dissatisfaction. So it doesn't mean that every one of us is going around feeling great suffering and pain every day of our lives. But we all do occasionally feel dissatisfaction and unease. So the first noble truth is that inevitably life involves suffering. The second noble truth is that we can actually discover the causes of suffering. And because of that, the third noble truth is that we can end our suffering. And we do that through the Eightfold Path. Now, suffering and narrative are connected to the root cause of what makes us unhappy, and that's ignorance. It's ignorance of these two key thoughts, these two key ideas, emptiness and impermanence. Now, it's really important to understand emptiness in the context of ourselves, but really hard to grasp. And we're going to resist that idea probably. The other one that we need to talk about is impermanence. Now, I'm going to follow the lead of Thich Nhat Hanh, because when he explains emptiness, he doesn't immediately go for talking about why emptiness applies to me. He uses a tree. He uses clouds. And these are great analogies. So this is the view from my backyard. And what we talk about when we think about emptiness is that there is no essential self, right? So when I look at that tree, I can't point to anything on that tree and say that is the essential treeness of that tree. You can take everything else away, but there'd still be this thing that was essential tree. Instead, that tree is a manifestation of all of its various parts and everything that goes into it. So there are leaves and there are limbs. There's the trunk, there's bark, there's roots that go into the soil, and there are nutriments within the soil that are all part of that tree. Those clouds that can produce rain and also nurture the tree are part of that tree. And the sunshine also is part of that tree. It's important to understand this idea of manifestation and that it applies to us as well. By clinging to the concept of an essential self and seeing the body as me, myself, and I, we get caught up in what's called dualistic thinking. Life becomes me versus them, me against the rest of the world, or simply me, me, me. I am the subject and everything else is the object. So dualistic thinking leads to judgment, evaluating everything and everyone as good or bad, as pleasurable or unpleasurable, desirable or undesirable, and that leads to suffering. The other important idea for us to understand is impermanence. And the tree works really well for that too for me, because I could not go out into my front yard and take a picture of the beautiful oak tree that was in front of my house when I moved in. Because a few years ago, a really huge limb from that oak tree fell, blocking the entire street. And that oak tree was diseased and had to be cut down. So nothing lasts. Everything is in a permanent state of change. problem with not understanding impermanence is that we cling. So even as we feel this happiness, if we don't understand impermanence, we have this underlying suffering as we worry about missing out and losing the thing that we care about. The Buddha has this to say about emptiness and impermanence. All worry about the self is vain. The ego is like a mirage, and all tribulations that touch it will pass away. They will vanish like a nightmare when the sleeper awakes. He who has awakened is freed from fear. He has become Buddha, because all of us have within us the Buddha nature. He knows the vanity of all his cares, his ambitions, and also of his pains. Now, how do we go about doing this, achieving this exit from ignorance? That is the Eightfold Path. So two things that are important to understand, even though the word path is here, it's not sequential or linear. All of these things are interconnected. And as Thich Nhat Hanh says, enter are. As well, because this is a practice and coming from experience, it's not doctrinal. Right is contextual. And right can be figured out by figuring out if it is good for all. So right view is good for you and everyone around you. Right view is directly connected to this issue of perspective. Knowing that we are prone to error due to our conceptual thinking, we must treat our perceptions with skepticism and release concepts and recognize how our concepts are the consequence of wrong perceptions. Right thinking means understanding things as they are, which can be really difficult because our bodies and our minds are often not doing the same thing. Guilty. Thich Nhat Hanh recommends asking ourselves the question, are you sure? Because we often operate as if we are absolutely positively sure, but in fact, we're making assumptions and guesses and writing stories. Thich Nhat Hanh also recommends that we say, hello, habit energy, because often we interact with what's around us based upon what has happened to us in the past. And so we're responding habitually and not to the present moment. That's what right mindfulness is about. Right mindfulness means you be here now without judgment. And that last part is important. So mindfulness has kind of gotten a grocery store aisle magazine cover reputation that makes us think that it's bliss, and it's not. Mindfulness can mean being in a moment of discomfort. It can be being in a moment of happiness, but it can be neutral. And it's just being okay with whatever is in that moment. Right speech is telling the truth without harm. And it also means deep listening, because being felt like you have been heard is enough to actually reduce someone's suffering. Right action is the mindful practice of nonviolence to all, including ourselves. And right diligence is directing effort to right goals, again, with that notion that the goal should be a benefit to all. Right concentration is connected to right mindfulness because it means single-minded focused attention. So for example, to cultivate mindfulness, we often will meditate. We use right concentration while meditating. If we do the traditional mode of meditation of just paying attention to our breath, we're concentrating. And right livelihood is work that doesn't compromise love or compassion. Austen's narrative style depicts realistically how our minds work. There's been a lot of work done on Austen by critics who are interested in the cognitive approach to literature and evolutionary psychology, because she got how our minds really misperceive and how we create our very important stories, to use Pema Chodron's term, with ourselves as the stars in such a way as to create our own suffering. Now, I organized the book in order of least enlightened to most enlightened. So I start with Pride and Prejudice. We get the happy ending in Pride and Prejudice, of course, but not happiness, as these characters really exemplify the cost of ignorance, what we were just talking about. There's no understanding of these ideas of emptiness, impermanence, and interconnectedness. And that is one of the poisons, ignorance. It leads to the second poison, which is attachment or craving. If in fact we see ourselves as these separate entities who must protect ourselves, then we are pleasure seekers. We're not really looking for happiness, for wholesomeness. And then we get really angry when we don't get those things that we think that we need to be happy. Now, the way that Austen sets up Pride and Prejudice, she's really letting these characters stew in these three poisons, because in fact, it is a setting of deficit and competition. There's just not enough men or enough money to go around. Henry Aronson writes that the Western emphasis on individuation, which we see in Pride and Prejudice, requires bridging a perceived gap between ourselves and others through conversation. But conversation fails repeatedly in the novel. Think of those proposal scenes, and especially in the use of wit as a defense mechanism and a power play. Wit often is a violation of right speech. Early in the novel, we have Mrs. Bennet proclaiming to Mr. Bennet, "You have no compassion on my poor nerves." From early in the novel, we're already finding Mrs. Bennet a bit annoying ourselves. And so I think our tendency is to actually have a little bit of compassion for Mr. Bennet. But in fact, Mr. Bennet is guilty of violating right speech throughout this novel. He's much more interested in wit, and he uses his wit on his family. He denigrates his children and his wife. He creates boundaries because he wants that library to himself. And he really makes the situation much worse instead of making it better. He fails at deep listening when Elizabeth goes to him and very sincerely, which he can see, appeals to him to not let Lydia go to Brighton. He's more interested in quipping than in actually listening to her. And of course, the family pays the cost for that. So we get our happy ending, but again, we don't get a sense of happiness as defined by Enlightenment. Now, Sense and Sensibility is a study of how concepts create unhappiness and prevent true love. Now, within a Buddhist definition, true love has four components. The first is loving kindness, and loving kindness starts with the self. It's creating a sense of connection, what we might call unconditional love, and it involves no craving. Compassion is the second part. Compassion involves the complete and fearless acceptance of the first noble truth, that reality of suffering for all, including ourselves. The third component is sympathetic joy, which means feeling no envy, rather feeling happiness for others when they succeed and not feeling as if that is taking something away from us. And the last part is equanimity, which is a sense of calm as we don't attempt to control other people and we accept impermanence. Concepts, on the other hand, create a sense of dualism, as we were talking about previously, that sense of me versus the rest of the world, a false perspective that prevents true love and represents a failure of right view because it implies that I have to be a winner. So false perspectives that we see in the novel include wealth. We can certainly see John Dashwood and family operating from that concept. Sense and sensibility, which is what many critics already talk about in covering this novel, and love. Love in the novel is not the same love as we see defined by Buddhism. Instead, love in the novel is the much more typical Western idea of love as passion, which implies a kind of separation or craving. Now, all of these ideas create boundaries and not happiness. And within the novel, to give a brief example, they actually make for some pretty bad parenting. Mrs. Ferrers, for example, is so caught by the concept of wealth that she is very controlling of all of her children and is incapable of understanding her own son, Edward, which I would argue leads him to being kind of vulnerable to the machinations of Lucy. He feels pretty lonely, I think. Mrs. Dashwood, caught by the ideas of sensibility and love as a passion, is unable to recognize that Willoughby is dangerous and that her own daughter, Eleanor, is actually suffering. Thich Nhat Hanh writes, if you do not give the right attention to the one you love, it is a kind of killing. We can see this with Marianne, really, because she's unable to give herself loving kindness. And so that refusal to give loving kindness to herself leads to her being dangerously ill. There's a lot at stake in having true love versus the concept of love. So once again, we get a happy ending, but I don't think we really reach enlightenment with Sense and Sensibility. Now, with Emma, we explicitly see how Emma's storytelling leads to suffering. I will argue, though, that in terms of theory of mind, which we already discussed, Emma does okay among her small circle. She starts to really get things wrong when those strangers are introduced, especially the one stranger who is definitely attempting, well, I guess it's two strangers who are attempting to deceive. And I believe it's that situation of the strangers being introduced where we see the real problem that Emma has is that she lacks empathy, which is being able to enter into the feelings of others. This makes sense because of her father, our great anxious hypochondriac, who is incapable of perspective taking and who teaches Emma to control the world rather than to adapt. I don't think there's a single time that Mr. Woodhouse has empathy in the novel Emma. Examples abound. We have the constant references to Miss Taylor, because not recognizing that, of course, this marriage is wonderful for her, but it's an inconvenience to him. Or when Mr. Knightley goes to London, it's very upsetting to him because it's unexpected. Whereas when Jane gets a position as a governess, which genuinely is very difficult news, he's okay with it because he just always knew it was going to happen. So he's always coming at life from this very egocentric perspective, and that's what Emma has grown up with. Fortunately, though, Emma does learn empathy, and she goes a step beyond that, and in fact learns compassion. So empathy is being able to enter into the feelings of others, but compassion actually allows us to want happiness for all beings. Of course, that happens in the famous Box Hill outing, where she is unkind to Miss Bates. After the discussion with Mr. Knightley, or you might call it a lecture, she is able to finally recognize her connection to Miss Bates and to take on a different perspective. And she cries. She has genuine feeling, genuine regret, and genuine compassion. With compassion in our heart, every thought, word, and deed can bring about a miracle. And that's why Emma gets a true happy ending, with our narrator finishing the book by telling us the wishes, the hopes, the confidence, the predictions of the small band of true friends who witnessed the ceremony were fully answered in the perfect happiness of the union. Now, Northanger Abbey is a study in the second noble truth, what makes us suffer, with an emphasis on consumption. For what we consume forms our habits. Now, there are 4 components within Buddhist consumption, because consumption is inevitable. So there's literal food, the food that we consume. But there are also the impressions made by the outside world on our senses. And so we're back to this idea of John Locke and knowing the world through our senses. There's also volition, which is our own aspirations and desires and the intent behind our actions. So it's not that we're not allowed to desire something, it's that it's important what we desire and why we desire it. And that feeds us. And then we also feed off of our consciousness, which is our own thoughts and feelings. This matters because, as Rick Hansen writes in Buddha's Brain, what flows through your attention sculpts your brain. Now, of course, Northanger Abbey is marked by consumption because of the setting itself in Bath. Now, Bath has those waters that the ill are supposed to consume in order to make themselves feel better, to heal. But of course, Bath had become a pleasure town. So there's all kinds of consumption of other activities and ideas such as fashion, as we find with Mrs. Allen, who is so consumed by the idea of looking fashionable that, in fact, she is not necessarily the best guardian for Kathryn. Then, of course, there is the marriage market, with Isabella Thorpe sort of offering herself up for sale. But I want to talk about the pineapples, because I think that the person who is the most conspicuous consumer in this novel is actually General Tilney. The pinery that he has on his estate is a huge outlay of capital. And the setting of an abbey is one that would historically be associated with being a place of charity. So there's a real discrepancy here between the way that the general is choosing to spend his money and the way that the abbey originally would have been using its money to help those in need. Now, Christopher Natali, in his work on Mansfield Park, on Northanger Abbey, looked into what would be involved with producing these pineapples. And he estimates that in modern dollars, one of those pineapples would have cost $12,000. The general, of course, is very upset that he was only able to produce 100 during that year. The general is both consuming and flaunting his wealth. And he fits the description really of the Dalai Lama of modern materialism, leading only to wanting more and a lack of contentment, that is, of suffering. Now, of course, we all know that one of the things that Northanger Abbey is very concerned with is the consumption of novels. And we get the panegyric to the novel from our narrator. Novels are work in which the greatest powers of the mind are displayed, in which the most thorough knowledge of human nature, the happiest delineation of its varieties, the liveliest effusions of wit and humor are conveyed to the world in the best chosen language. Novels teach us about perspective taking. They enhance our empathy, and they require the use of imagination. Of course, none are better than Austen's at doing this. So Northanger Abbey is really an argument for mindful consumption. Western critics often see Fanny Price as passive, poor Fanny, or even prig. But from a Buddhist perspective, she is a bodhisattva, a figure devoted to enlightenment for the purpose of helping others. A bodhisattva works to awaken bodhicitta, which is the mind of love, a deep wish to understand in order to cultivate happiness for all, which Fanny does in a text that's very much marked by its selfishness. The Bodhisattva doesn't seek suffering or pain, but accepts whatever is. So rather than Fanny as a doormat, her acceptance and resilience are marks of enlightenment. Fanny knows how to suffer, having lived as an outsider within her own home and with her own health problems, unlike her spoiled cousins. Shantideva, an 8th century Indian prince, wrote the most important text on the Bodhisattva called The Way of the Bodhisattva. And he talks about the value of adversity. There's nothing that does not grow light through habit and familiarity. Putting up with little cares, I'll train myself to bear with great adversity. And that is, in fact, what Fanny Price is able to do. I didn't want to be Anne Elliot back when I took that BuzzFeed quiz because I didn't understand the value of adversity. I just wanted it to go away. Anne's situation is lonely and dire, but she does not suffer. Rather, she accepts her life as it is. She's not feeding off every imagined slight as her sister Mary does. Nor does she hope like her sister Elizabeth, for to hope is to dwell in lack, to feel like you need more. She doesn't engage in dramatic narrative that would only exacerbate what is wrong. She watches Wentworth with his flirting, and she recognizes what is happening, but she doesn't add a dramatic storyline to that. She is able to cultivate equanimity in the face of these dismal circumstances by following the Eightfold Path. The Dalai Lama writes, encountering sufferings will definitely contribute to the elevation of your spiritual practice, provided you are able to transform the calamity and misfortune into the path. I think Anne Elliot does that. Now, having talked about the fact that stories are very much about either making us suffer or can help us to be happy, I conclude my book talking about this idea of bibliotherapy. And that is being able to read fiction in a way that is therapeutic. J.K. Rowling has Dumbledore say in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, "Of course it is happening inside your head, Harry, but why on earth should that mean that it is not real?" And it turns out she's correct. Science shows what the Buddha and Austen intuited when it comes to the power of stories. Graduate students put into an MRI and told to read Mansfield Park carefully had parts of their brains light up as if they were performing the same physical tasks as the characters. In other words, when Fanny Price was dancing, the parts of our brain that would be in charge of us dancing light up as well. Our brains don't really know the difference between fiction and reality. Liz Brewster talks about bibliotherapy and how reading fiction carefully in this way and reading the right books in the same way that Austen is arguing we should in Northanger Abbey can be of benefit. Bibliotherapy allows the reader to see that she's not alone in having a particular problem. It demonstrates there is more than one solution to the problem. It provides access to the motives of the characters within their defined context. It humanizes and makes more concrete moral values, which is why all major religions use stories to teach their lessons. It offers facts that might help in solving the problem experienced by the reader. and it inspires the reader to realistically face the problem faced by the character. Now, Austen has been historically used in bibliotherapy. In World War I, from 1917 to 1920, the American Library Association collected more than 100 million books to distribute. And of course, Austen was among those writers who was represented. During World War II, in 1942, Penguin Books published 120 titles to distribute to soldiers. And among those titles was Northanger Abbey and Persuasion. Rudyard Kipling, when he lost his son in 1917 during World War I, read Austen to comfort himself and his family. He read aloud to them at night. And in 1924, he published his short story, The Janeites, which is set after World War I and is a description of how Jane was used in the trenches as a way to bring comfort and community to the soldiers. One of the soldiers says, "You take it from me, brethren, there's no one to touch Jane when you're in a tight place. God bless her," whoever she was. Ultimately then, both Austen and the Buddha teach the same things: not to get caught by stories, and that our duty is to be happy. If we are happy, we are good to each other. And since we are all connected, my happiness is your happiness, and yours is mine. I'd actually like to conclude by reading the epilogue to my book. It took me 5 years to write this book. Life was busy and challenging. I taught a lot of extra classes to make up for the loss of income due to divorce. I cared for a close family member who struggled with chronic illness. Both of my parents had dementia. Both died. With other Floridians, I dealt with tropical storms and hurricanes. My ceiling collapsed right on top of me. And I don't care what my insurance company claims. Of course it was because of the hurricane. Like all of us, I'm living through a global pandemic. I write that not to complain, but to share that I'm more at peace and happier than I've been in my life. Yes, during the global pandemic. The Buddha and Austen were right about suffering and the cure for suffering. Where I see this clearly in my own life is in my mother's dementia and death. Mom was still high functioning when she had a TIA on July 27th, 2019. Ironically, I had just finished reading the preface to this book at a gathering of writing friends in my home when I got the call that Mom was in the emergency room. My daughter, then 15, and I rushed over while my amazing friends cleaned up the party and got my daughter's friend home. That time in the emergency room is a fond memory. Mom was the most cheerful, optimistic, and loving person, qualities enhanced by her dementia, because dementia had released her from anxiety. We talked animatedly and joked. We were happy to be together. Her test results were fine, so we took her back to the assisted living facility in the early morning hours of July 28th. I tucked her into bed and we said goodnight. The major stroke came a few hours later, and we would never have another conversation. She was still alert when I saw her that morning, but she could no longer speak. I spent 5 days with her at the hospital, and she died under hospice care back in her room at Arden Courts on August 15th. I sat by her side, singing to her. That too is a bittersweet memory, as I felt honored to guide her through a peaceful death. Mom was my best friend, and I suffered. But I'd learned to suffer, and thanks to understanding impermanence, I knew my suffering wouldn't last forever. I will always miss my mom, but I know deeply that she is still with me, that she endures. Even more importantly, Austen and Buddhism taught me during Mom's life to let go of the fear that overtook me with her diagnosis of dementia. That fear built a wall between us. Releasing the fear allowed me a closeness with her stronger than any I had experienced, which is saying a lot, given the lifelong closeness of our relationship. Dementia allows a person to be truly present, and I allowed myself to be truly present with my mom. The last part of her life was our happiest together, for which I have great gratitude. Anecdotally, then, I assure you that mindfully releasing the narrative works. Austen gives us happy endings. Buddhism teaches us that we can create happiness for ourselves and others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathryn, and thank you for sharing the epilogue to your book. That was truly a wonderful talk. I would like to
thank you so much.
I'd like to remind our audience members that there's still time to drop in questions in the Q&A as we begin. I already see some comments popping up saying that that epilogue was beautiful, Kathryn. So thank you again. So I would like to begin with a question from an audience member that I think would be a great start to this conversation. From what you know of Jane Austen's letters, of her life, and of the novels that you presented to us this evening, do you think she practiced a mindful life herself, or what we would understand today as these terms of mindfulness, or within the terms of that Eightfold Path?
I feel like what Austen, I'm sorry, I'm staring off in the distance because that's what I do when I'm thinking. And I roll my eyes too. And I'm not rolling my eyes at anybody. I just look up in my brain to see what the answer is. I think for me, and I'll see if I can come back to this idea of mindfulness, but I feel like I have to start here. I think that Austen understood suffering in the same vein that we experience and understand suffering. In other words, Austen is not writing War and Peace. She's had that criticism, right? That she's just like, oh, you're just writing about everyday things in everyday life and very narrow. But I think that's why she has endured for us, because I think for Austen herself, here is this an amazing, talented woman who had to live within a patriarchal culture that did not want to encourage that talent. She's a woman who sold her first novel and then didn't get it published and couldn't get it back. Right. And so she understood the same kinds of smaller, but potentially truly painful things that each of us experienced. Now, she had a wit. When I talk about right speech and wit, we know that she could have that biting tongue. So I think that's there, but I guess I have to confess that I like wit as well. And so I think what she had was an ability to really, she had emotional awareness. So I think she could get away with that wittiness. I think she had the mindfulness to understand that being married wasn't for her and that she was not going to settle into convention merely to please others. I think that she was willing to live a more difficult life, really, in order to do the things that she truly cared about. So without getting to actually speak with her, I am reading the Jane Austen Project with my West Coast Jasna friends. So I would love to go in time travel and ask her this herself. But I think with the ability to understand human psychology the way that she has, then I would say, yeah, I think she had an inherent understanding of mindfulness.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn. I admire your pioneering spirit and in bringing together all these disciplines in a very unusual book, and just having the courage to take on a project like this. And I admire it very much. I guess a question, and I hope our audience will post some more questions for us. The queue is empty. But I guess a question that I imagine people are thinking about is why this I think that you explain the parallel phenomena between Buddhism and what's going on in Austen, but why is there this parallel phenomenon, do you think? You're not making a historical claim, as far as I can tell.
No, I mean, I'm not claiming she knew about Buddhism, no. But interestingly enough, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, there's a couple of references here. There are other 18th century authors that seem to be thinking along these sort of same veins, right? So this idea of interconnectedness, for example, if you look at Alexander Pope's essay on man, where he talks about, I'm not going to be able to quote it, but he's making this comparison to the great chain of being and the interconnectedness. And he said, it'd be a real problem. Forgive me, Alexander Pope, for messing this up like this, but it'd be a real problem if the foot wanted to be the head, right? So it's like everything is interconnected and everything has a purpose. Or if you look at Samuel Johnson's Vanity of Human Wishes, which is his imitation of Juvenal, where he's talking about it's this craving, right? And this attachment that is causing us to suffer and causing us to be miserable. It's also the time, of course, that is in fact the rise of the novel. So there really is this new interest in the individual's story and telling the individual's story. So I guess if we go back to my tree analogy and the idea of manifestation and parts having to come together, I feel like there was something happening within the Enlightenment with these new ideas about the individual, the primacy of experience, knowing the world through our senses, which is essentially the ideas that the Buddha was presenting long before. So it's not that I'm saying that they were imitating Buddhism, knowing about Buddhism, but that is a cultural period that was just ripe for those same kinds of ideas to kind of grow and flourish.
So there's this question about your intellectual, so what parts of your intellectual work did you draw on? I think, I'm not sure whether this person is wanting to ask about some of the philosophical influence in the Western tradition, or you've just mentioned, Samuel Johnson, I think, is probably a great influence on Jane Austen as well. Right. So, I was kind of making connection when you mentioned the word unease. I don't know if you had his, image in mind, because he was constantly, in the state of unease throughout his life. And I kind of thought that Austen sympathized with his work because of this idea of unease. And I can easily relate to your interest in Austen because of that essential core part of her work, which is suffering and unease. And I'm not sure whether this person wanted to ask about that in particular, but I was thinking about also the emptiness that kind of has been emphasized throughout the Western tradition in relation to, for example, Nietzsche, because Nietzsche was kind of depressed because of this Western tradition. If you assume there's a standpoint of an individual, if you lose it, you're going to be disappointed greatly, and that's where emptiness comes out. And I kind of think that Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy kind of fills in that gap of emptiness because it's not there, because permanence is not secured or guaranteed. And so I don't know if this person wants to ask about that kind of Buddhist or even sort of Nietzsche kind of philosophy tradition, but I think you're drawing on so many intellectual work that I think, you know, a lot of the audience may want to know more about where you are drawing all of these ideas from. And I could actually kind of see a glimpse of all these things, you know, behind your talk, which is so thrilling and fantastic. So I really do want to ask more, if you can.
Thank you. So I'll go back to the dissertation, which was on 18th century British pirates, which again, I can't answer the question what it says about my personality. But as I continued the work on 18th century British pirates, my key question really was, you know, because I always tell my students you have to have a research question, was why does everybody hate them so much? So, I mean, we have this kind of romantic idea of the pirate, and, you know, you can go ride Pirates of the Caribbean over at Disney, and, you know, with the swashbuckling idea. But at the 18th century image of pirates, back when there were actually pirates on the seas, was they were the worst of all possible criminals, just the absolute worst. And they, you know, were the hanging chains at the end of docks and left as examples. And they were, you know, in league with the devil. I mean, when you read this stuff, it's just really pretty much over the top. And, you know, I get it, you know, like piracy isn't good or whatever, but but why would the average person in England who is probably never going to set sail on a ship so concerned about pirates, right? Like, shouldn't the highwaymen be worse or something? And so I just got interested in that way through these ideas of evolutionary psychology. And so evolutionary psychology and a cognitive approach to literature has been really something that I've been using in my work for, I don't even know anymore, maybe 20 years. The problem with the pirate is that the pirate does not engage in reciprocity, right? So if we're going to live in community, and that's how we're going to stay alive as a species, we have to stay together in communities. The pirate is a cheater, right? And he's not contributing. And so that explained this, like, the over the top kind of visceral response to the pirate. I then moved on to Methodist, which I know sounds like a big leap, but it wasn't. And so actually I grew up Methodist. My grandfather was a Methodist minister, so I grew up in the Methodist church. And I was surprised to discover post-PhD, so fully into adulthood, that Methodists were really hated in the 18th century. They were physically attacked in the 18th century. So again, I was kind of looking for an answer to this question of why are these people hated so much? So I'm always historicizing in the work that I've done, but I feel like evolutionary psychology does have some answers to why we don't like these outliers and these folks who don't engage in reciprocity. So I've come at my work from that angle a lot. And then of course from even just more conventional psychology. So I read a lot of psychology articles as well. The cool thing about that MRI is we can now actually see scientifically that a lot of the ideas, for example, that the Buddha had, can be scientifically proven. And then just kind of the conventional, of course, close reading of being a scholar in English, because my degree is in 18th century British literature.
Wow, thank you so much.
Okay, I'm going to start this next one off with a comment of my own, and I'm going to tie it into a question from the audience because I find this all very interesting. I would like to bring it back to when you were talking about the ways in which people experience through literature, particularly, you know, in the MRI, as you gave that example. You know, we have recent studies too that show reading improves empathy. And reading improves theory of mind, which is our ability to comprehend lives beyond our own. And then I was thinking back towards the 18th century again, what they would have called transportive literature, literature that transports you to another place, activates the imagination, and the ways that they saw that as a form of experiencing something beyond yourself as well, kind of replicating experience as a didactic tool, using the transportive. And then this question brings up, you know, Deborah says, I too have reread Austen during times of personal challenge. At the time, I thought it was an escape. Would you say Austen actually relieves suffering, taking us through, like being willing to let go of attachments rather than escape? And I think there's three really interesting things there: transportation, escape, and relief. And I don't know if you have any comments on the ways that Austen or literature function. Like, do you think Austen was meant to be cathartic, an escape, didactic, or a mix?
I guess I would go back to sort of like good old fashioned reader response theory for that, right? I think it's contextual. I mean, it's kind of like when you think about the Eightfold Path and it's right, whatever, right? I think it's contextual. I think it depends on the place where you are. Austen's texts are themselves stable beings, right? I mean, they don't change. What changes is us when we approach them. So I think that Austen can certainly be read as pure escape and pleasure, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And I think that it also can be read didactically, and it can do again all of the kind of things that Liz Brewster lays out with bibliotherapy, because I don't think it's an accident that when you look at prescriptions for bibliotherapy, Austen is always popping up, and that again she has such a large readership still so many years later.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's so many good questions here. I guess this, turning back to the novels, one of the audience members asks whether you think that Anne Elliot was actually the most enlightened of all Austen's heroines, and how she, again, this is speculative, but how she might manage to live well for the rest of her life.
So I think that one of the things that, I'm not unique in noting this, others have noted it as well, is that Anne gets her happy ending, but it is the least clean and neat, in the sense that it talks about the only thing anybody worried about was there being another war, right? And so she's got her guy, right? But her guy is set up to go live a life of peril. So I think Anne will be okay. I will be happy to be speculative about that, because I think Anne has learned how to suffer. So you can be happy if you know how to suffer, right? So she is someone who I think is able to accept that life is not safe anyway, right? So there are riskier lives and less risky lives, but life is never safe anyway. So you just have to understand that, yep, things can change quickly, but appreciate what you have in that moment. I think she has that ability to just inhabit the space where she is, because can see her do that throughout the entire novel.
Just to follow up, are you also then are you suggesting the reason behind that strange prominence of Mrs. Smith at the end of Persuasion, where with her choicest gift of heaven being this cheer that she has?
Yeah, I talk about her in contrast to Benwick in the novel, because Benwick, I mean, he wants to stay in that place of suffering, and he wants the attention, he wants to dramatize it, and Mrs. Smith is just she understands that our happiness will not be found out here in external circumstances. Now, that does not mean she does not want to change her external circumstances. Of course she does. And of course, we want to be comfortable. We want to be able to be in, we don't want to live every day in adversity, even if adversity might help us in our spiritual path, right? But the happiness is going to be found from that mindfulness and living the Eightfold Path. It's not going to be from external circumstances.
Is it my turn? my question is sort of connected to one of the audience's question about Austen male characters. This person says, while you focused on Austen female characters, which of Austen male characters do you think might be considered to be more or less in line with Buddhist precepts and teachings? I wanted to choose this, question because I was thinking kind of similar things. Recently, I think there's been a lot of research done on characters who are in adverse situation and who suffer a lot in Austen research. And one of the research I thought is kind of related to your approach is Barbara Sieber's Jane Austen and Animals. She talks a lot about women and animals who suffer. And I think there's been a kind of shift from focusing a lot on female characters desiring more to women who sort of contemplate on their suffering and try to live with that suffering. And so it was fascinating to hear more about that kind of suffering, how to cope with that situation. So this book on animals focus on Darcy and, as for male characters, Darcy and Knightley, because they are more like these suffering females who are more sensitive, are not a typical sort of aggressive type of male characters like Henry Crawford, who love hunting, is probably the most remotest from, the teaching of Buddha, for example. So I was kind of, hoping, you could give us more of your perspective on male characters, maybe connecting with some of the things that have been said already, maybe, or maybe, something that you found out from reading Austen novels from Buddhist perspective.
I'd have to go with one that you mentioned just now, and I would probably say Mr. Knightley. He's perceptive throughout. I think he has compassion. I feel like he's able to engage in empathy. He seems to approach mindfully. He's cares about everyone essentially, right? One of the things that's interesting is this idea that Emma literally says that no, she doesn't know who Robert Martin is because he's just outside of being able to be noticed by her, right? So he's not a gentleman and he's not super poor, so she couldn't help him, kind of thing, right? But when you look at Mr. Knightley, he's attentive to the Bates, he's attentive to Robert Martin. He's actually attentive to Harriet, really. He's the one person who seems to suspect something going on with Jane. So I think I'm going to give my vote to Knightley. Aptly named Knightley.
Me too. Thank you.
We have a great question and comment. So I'm just going to read this out in full from Michelle. Long before I heard bibliotherapy, I'd joke, because I was embarrassed by the truth, that when distressed and upset, I'd read Jane Austen and listen to Bach, and my world would right itself again. There's since been quite a bit of research on Baroque music, brainwaves, and the stabilization of mental, physical, and emotional rhythms. Other than the soft benefits you listed for bibliotherapy, has anyone tried to understand scientifically why Austen has this calming effect?
I haven't run across that, but I will certainly let you know, because I think that's where I really want to go next, is I want to dive more deeply into bibliotherapy, even just beyond Austen. So I'm kind of calling it in my head Britlit and bibliotherapy. I haven't run across that, but I would love to go looking and find out.
I think there's a little bit on that in the book called Jane on the Brain.
Oh yeah, Jane on the Brain. Yeah.
I've forgotten now the name of the editor of that book, but that is, she has some essays that definitely broach on that subject.
You're right about that. I have that book. I need to go look at that book.
I think in general, there's been more and more research, as you brought up, right, about the effects of reading on the brain. But I would love to see what different authors, what kinds of reactions they provoke on people. So I thought that was a very interesting question. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great.
So we have a couple of questions on Jane's Christianity and whether there are parallels between Christianity and Buddhism on some of these issues. One of the audience members says is talking about Pure Land Buddhism, where Buddha graciously suffers on behalf of others in order to bring them to enlightenment, and a parallel with the role of Jesus. Just more generally, have you thought about the similarities and differences between Christianity and Buddhism on some of these points?
Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a book called Living Buddha, Living Christ. And so in that book, and I would recommend it, he talks about these parallels. So of course, Buddhism does not recognize Jesus as a savior or a son of God, but Thich Nhat Hanh basically refers to him as a bodhisattva. So again, someone who is seeking enlightenment for the happiness of others. So certainly, I think that there is a lot of parallels with the discussion of suffering and trying to reach enlightenment. But the difference being between there being a deity and not being a deity.
Your mentioning Kipling was great. I was so surprised to hear what he had to say about the reading list of soldiers. There's a question related to that topic, I think. Why do you think Penguin specifically chose to publish Northanger Abbey and Persuasion among the 100 books they sent to the soldiers? What aspects of these novels and their relation to Buddhism do you think they thought would appeal to or help the soldiers?
Yeah, I mean, I think Persuasion is, just from my perspective, I think is a great choice, given that, again, I would argue that Anne Elliot teaches us how to suffer well, how not to suffer by suffering well. Northanger Abbey was a little bit of a surprise to me, if I'm honest, out of all of Austen. I mean, I love Northanger Abbey, and I think that it's very funny, but I think that the only issue with Northanger Abbey is this, the referential nature of it can make it a little bit less accessible. But I like Kathryn in that she is someone who is not caught by concepts. I sort of argue that she escapes that ladies' education, and she's kind of allowed to run around and be herself and be a girl, and so she gets caught by the Gothic novel perspective. But I think the thing about Kathryn is that she's able to recognize that it happened, that she adopted a perspective, and that it was a mistaken perspective. Whereas the other characters in the novel are not even aware, right, that they've kind of are coming at life from a perspective. And throughout all of Northanger Abbey, she has good volition. She doesn't care about being embarrassed. She is going to tell the truth. She wants to be honest. She's open-hearted. So I think in that way, she would be someone that would be, perhaps inspiring to read as you were facing really difficult tribulations in fighting a war.
And there's also criticism of Captain Tilney too, which probably was, it's also a very, an enjoyable read.
It is.
They also, I think, didn't they also focus on making those really small? And those are the only 2-volume Austen. Those two are the 2-volume Austen novels. and they were published
There's always the
together.
practical stuff.
Sorry to be so mundane, but I think that
No, that's good. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Kathryn, for joining us tonight for such a thoughtful and intriguing talk.
Well, thank you again so much for having me.
Yeah, we're absolutely delighted to have you join us. And we are so excited that all of you in the audience could join us tonight for the last in our Asia the Regency series. Hold on real quick. We still have a few announcements to make before we part for the evening and for the summer. Now, we here at Jane Austen and Company are going on our summer hiatus, which means we will not be providing programming over the summer. However, we encourage you to look back at our library of nearly 30 videos, talks, and events over the summer. Catch up. We have a lot of great programs that we've recorded, and we will be back in the fall. Keep an eye out on your inboxes because we will be sending a survey around to get your opinions and feedback. Asia and the Regency was chosen as a topic thanks to audience feedback, and we want to know your opinions about what you would like to see next fall and next spring. Now, we have two ideas in the running. They're everyday science in the Regency, which would look at everyday technologies and the development of science and industry in that period. And then the other idea is what Austen read, which would focus on the books that Austen herself read and enjoyed. But if you have other ideas or you have ideas for topics within those, we would love to hear them.
Sorry, I was just posting the link to our past recordings in the chat since you mentioned that, Anne. So that link is there in the chat if you want to catch up on our catalog over the summer, as Anne mentioned. And if in addition you want to read more about Jane Austen, her life, afterlives, and adaptations, you can check out the blog for the Jane Austen Summer Program or follow us on social media. JASP is a 4-day summer symposium that typically takes place in June in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. This year's theme is Austen and Shakespeare, taking place June 16th through 19th. So join us for lectures, hands-on workshops, small discussion groups, exhibits, and other activities that blend scholarship with fandom. Sorry if you hear my dog loudly drinking her water in the background. I apologize. The event is currently full, but there is a wait list that you can join. So go to our website, janeaustensummer.org.
Yeah, and two additional reasons to come or join the wait list was one is that Kathryn will be there. And the other is that the theme is Mansfield. The Austen book this year is Mansfield Park. So if you were excited by Fanny as Bodhisattva, you have a chance to pursue those ideas. And I want to give an extra very warm thank you to Jared also, Jared Powell, who's leaving us, unless we can convince him otherwise, he's leaving us as technical director. So thank you, Jared, for all you've done.
Thank you, I appreciate it. It's been fun.
And thank you to the 130 people or so who attended today's event. This program was supported in part by North Carolina Humanities. And we want to thank the UNC's Humanities for the Public Good, as well as the Carolina Asia Center at UNC for their support. Please do consider making a gift to the Jane Austen Summer Program. If you're in the US, we're a registered nonprofit, so it's tax deductible. And these things help us keep it free and open to the public and to bring in great speakers like Kathryn. They also support our other activities like giving teachers free scholarships to attend our Jane Austen Summer Program. We're also looking for sponsors, people who might want to sponsor individual sessions or a whole series. But thank you all. Thank you so much, Kathryn, for an inspiring talk, and all of you for attending. And we wish you all a wonderful summer.
Thank you all for joining us.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.